am the chair of the Women's European Platform in Northern Ireland. And NIWEP exists to give women and girls in Northern Ireland a voice at the national and international level. We work to strengthen women's effective participation in public life and policy making by building capacity and sharing international learning on women's rights and on human rights. And so I am delighted today to be joined by some truly awesome women from across the UK, Ireland, Europe, and really the globe. And they're joining us today for our discussion. But before we start, just a very, very quick bit of housekeeping, just to let you know that we are recording today's session and we're also live streaming on YouTube. So it's just to give you awareness of that. I suppose we're going to have a two-part session today, and with a Q&A in between. So as you're listening to the speakers, I do encourage you to, if you have any questions at all, the little chat function down along the bottom there, if you can just put your question, your comment, your thought, anything in the chat, and then when we get to the Q&A, we'll go through those and keep the discussion going. I suppose we have 90 minutes for our event today, and I don't think it won't take longer than that. In any event, we get booted out after 90 minutes. So, but we'll have plenty of time to get a really great and rich discussion going in that 90 minutes. And finally, I just want to say we want to make this a fully inclusive feminist space here at our event today. So let's stick to challenging and discussing issues instead of people, and keeping all discussion and comments respectful. That would be great, and I really appreciate you cooperating in that. So with that done, on to our main event. Later on, we're going to be hearing from 4 young women on their perspective on a peaceful future on our islands. And I'm really excited to hear from them. But first, though, we have our first set of 3 speakers. Of Agnieszka Falducci-Santos, who is the program coordinator at the Global Network of Women Peace Builders. Agnieszka coordinates GNWP's work on women, peace and security implementation, including through localization. She is the organization's focal point for the work in Eastern Europe and South Caucasus region. She also oversees the work in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and North Africa for the organization. Agnieszka coordinates GNWP's research and global advocacy on peace building and sustaining peace, the links between CEDAW and women, peace and security, and financing for WPS as well. Our second speaker is Funeka Manzi from the Foundation for Human Rights in South Africa. Funeka is the Monitoring and Evaluation Officer at the Foundation for Human Rights. She is a staunch feminist with experience working in the fields of women, peace and security agenda, gender-based violence, and sexual reproductive rights. She has worked closely with the Department of International Relations in ensuring that the WPS agenda is a priority. She has also facilitated provincial consultations with women across the country on inputting towards the development of South Africa's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. And finally, for the first part of our session, we have Cochaleen Higgins-Nicaneda from the Department of Foreign Affairs in Ireland. Cochaleen is Deputy Director of the Conflict Resolution Unit in DFA Ireland, and that unit leads on the department's policy into women, peace and security, and provides a secretariat to the oversight group of Ireland's 3rd National Action Plan. Cochaleen previously worked on Ireland's UN Security Council election campaign and served as consul in Ireland's embassy in Madrid. So welcome to our 3 speakers. The format's going to be, I'm going to give you 10 minutes to speak each, and then we will have a Q&A after. So without further ado, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand it over first to Agnieszka. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Louise, and thank you to NIWEP for organizing this space and this excellent discussion. And we had a similar discussion couple of weeks or maybe a month ago, and I think it's one that's critical to keep having as we've passed that that important and critical and strange year 2020, where we celebrated the many anniversaries, the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which kind of lives on now this year with the Generation Equality Forum being postponed to this year. The fifth anniversary of the Resolution 2250 on youth, peace, and security. But at the same time, we've lived all of those important milestones and the review of the UN peacebuilding architecture. At the same time, we've lived this really extraordinary year that has brought to light and exacerbated so many of the challenges to women's rights, to gender equality, to peace and peace building, and to where the two meet. So that the peace building that is led by women-led peace building work around the world. So as we continue to as we move on, I guess, beyond these milestones for these various resolutions, at the same time, continue to live through the pandemic, live with the pandemic, and prepare, hopefully, to recover. And there is a lot of discussions about the recovery from the pandemic, and some say, we're still in the midst of it, which is very true. But it's like peace building during conflict. Recovery does not and should not only start once we're all vaccinated and there's no more COVID cases. Indeed, this is something to be thinking about already. What are being the long-term impacts, the economic impacts, the peace-building impacts of the pandemic, and how do we respond to them in a way that's both gender responsive and conflict sensitive to the conflict dynamics in the country or community we're talking about. So with that, the few questions you shared are just so excellent and thought-provoking. And one of them was, as we are moving on beyond 2020, what does a peaceful future look like to women peace builders, to myself, and to women that we at the Global Network of Women Peace Builders work with? And to that, I think I'd like to share some reflections that were shared with us by our members. We did a research back in 2018 in which we have asked women activists and women peace builders and civil society from 50 countries what peace meant to them. And that was done in the framework of the UN peace building and sustaining peace resolutions that were 2 years on, and the sort of operationalization framework for them was being developed. And to that question, what does peace mean to you? Only 25% of our respondents said that defined it as an absence of war or absence of armed hostilities. Of course, that's important, that's critical, that's the first step, let's say. But most of the women we spoke to believe that peace requires much more than that. We had respondents from all parts of the world, but including countries that are traditionally perceived as peaceful, such as even Canada or Sweden, say, we do not think our country is fully peaceful, because to us peace means a lot of things. It means inclusive institutions. It means having economic opportunities for all. It means fair and sustainable use of natural resources. And it also means a culture of peace, defined as a culture of tolerance, understanding, and non-violent resolution of conflicts. And I think today, in the age of COVID-19, this resonates really so strongly, because we see the importance of this broad understanding and broad definition of peace more than ever. So in line with this definition brought to us by the women peace builders we spoke to, I think what is important to think about as we think about a peaceful future is to imagine a future where human security, including all of those elements that I mentioned before, is both recognized. The importance of that human security is recognized and supported, including in the implementation of women peace and security. So more and more we speak to our members, and the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, I should have led with that, is a network of more than 100 organizations in more than 50 countries. And most of our members are women-led peace building organizations. And many of them, as we discuss with them, as we support them, as they advance the implementation of women peace and security in their country, they say we need more of a human security lens in our national action plans on women peace and security, in our and other policies related to peace and security in our country, in the COVID-19 response and recovery plans. So that is extremely relevant and important, I think, as we think about the peaceful future and a feminist future. And it also requires a shift at at the sort of macro level, the global level, in the spending and the let's say financial priorities. And we know, and that was something that we were very glad to see in the report of the Secretary General on Women, Peace and Security last year. We know that global military spendings continue to climb, and they have reached a record, another record, 1.9 trillion US dollars in 2019. And meanwhile, we know that most national action plans on women, peace and security do not have dedicated budgets, which makes it impossible or at least very, very difficult to implement. We know that women-led peace-building organizations lack funds to implement their own work, their own projects. And we know that the investment in social and health infrastructure is often insufficient. And all this is not to say that we do not appreciate those working in the security sector, the police and military, and their role in maintaining or sustaining peace and security. On the contrary, we work with those actors throughout our work, throughout our localization lens. But this is to say that in order to build the sustainable peace, the vision of peace that centers on human security and the broader understanding of peace, there is a need for greater balance and for greater investment in those solutions, those responses to that are rooted in prevention, that are rooted in addressing root causes of conflict, and are rooted in creating and building that culture of peace. And women peace builders, as again our study and many pieces of research, including a more recent research that we've conducted with support from UN Women in Ireland just last year, show that women peace builders are really at the forefront of these innovative approaches and of addressing the root causes of conflict, including the new roots or those that have been exacerbated by COVID. So what are the priorities for action? I'll just, I know my time is probably almost up, so I'll just finish here with sort of two directions or two broad areas for action that we see in this context. The first one is localization and acting more at the local level. And at the global network of women peace builders, we have pioneered the localization of women peace and security strategy 10 years ago now, and we've implemented it since in 16 countries around the world. And today our call, our advocacy and our work is to really make it a standard practice. It has been recognized as a good practice and our best practice. We're grateful for that. We're grateful and happy that it's being replicated by various actors in different countries where we work. But we want to see it become a standard practice, because what localization does is it brings together local women peace builders, members of local communities, including internally displaced persons, refugees, those most affected by conflict, with local authorities, and provides them with a space to jointly discuss, to analyze those global laws, but also analyze the needs and priorities in terms of peace and security in their local context, and to together identify the necessary steps to implement it. And that often leads to either amendment or adoption of new local policies and plans and strategies. So really institutionalizing those commitments in a way that's relevant to the local context, and ultimately leading to a more gender responsive and conflict sensitive local governance, something that is definitely always important, and perhaps even more so in the aftermath of COVID-19. And the second big area of action that I wanted to highlight is support to women peace builders, both the financial support, which I already spoke about, but also support in terms of protection. Women peace builders, and this is something that came out of the study that we've conducted with support from UN Women and Ireland, and women peace builders and human rights defenders are under attack. They're under attack like never before, said one of our interviewees in that research. So it is necessary to really step up our commitment and action to protect them. And this may mean supporting early warning and early response mechanisms, especially those run and led by local women peace builders, by networks of women at the local level. It might also mean publicly condemning attacks on women peace builders and human rights defenders and strengthening the legal frameworks that protect them. When diplomats in a country or the UN Security Council or other bodies publicly denounce attacks on women, it can make a huge difference. And just recently, during the protests in Myanmar, our partners are calling, and we continue to support them in their calls to bring attention to the violence against protesters and including women and youth. And in fact, actions by diplomats in country, for example, visiting detention centers where protesters are being held, are making a big difference. So this public recognition of the importance to protect women and youth peace builders and public denouncing of such attacks can really have a great value to those grassroots activists, to women peace builders and human rights activists. And finally, I'll just wrap up with saying there was a question in that list, what level should we focus on? Is it locally, nationally, internationally? And I would add regionally to that mix. And I just want to close on the reflection saying that I think in order to really reach that vision of sustainable and feminist peace, we do need to act across all of those levels. We say at GNWP, our strategy or our overarching methodology is going from local to global and from global to local across all of the levels, because we do need this focus on localization, on the local peace builders who are at the forefront and who need more support, political, financial, and in terms of protection. But we do, one of the things that is often most appreciated by our partners is creating those spaces where they can interact with each other across local communities, across countries, across regions, but where they can also interact with colleagues, with peace builders who act at national level or those working with regional or international institutions. So we do need to work at all levels, but also across all levels and strengthen those linkages is what I would say. And I'll stop here because I want us to have time for discussion. But thank you once again for creating this space and bringing us together.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka, for that. Already we're getting some questions in and people thanking us for the panel and the discussion that's already started. And just really interesting perspectives there on creating space and protecting women peace builders. I'm going to go straight on to our second speaker, to Funeka. And like I said, keep your questions coming in via the chat, and we will have a Q&A after the first three speakers. Thank you. Funeka, over to you.
Thank you so much, Louise. As stated before, I work for a foundation for human rights in South Africa, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity and look forward to the questions and everything and all the contributions from our panel. So I just would like to start to say that we've just recently launched our first generation National Action Plan last week. And it's quite a momentous event for our country, especially for civil society activists, human rights defenders who've been lobbying for the adoption of development of a national action plan for South Africa. So it's quite a huge triumph for activists, especially also the foundation was facilitating provincial consultations with women across the country, to get their voices and their opinions on how they feel, or their contributions to be meaningfully represented in the draft National Action Plan, and they definitely have been represented. And so this is quite a huge triumph for our organization and for our country in general, especially because we are, of course, a country that's not currently in conflict. But I know a lot of debates in this space discuss issues of, I know a lot of, excuse me about that. I know a lot of activists in this space say peace is not just the absence of conflict, and we absolutely agree. We also noticed since 2018, a lot of developments in the country whereby activists were calling for gender-based violence and femicide to be considered a national threat in the country and to be taken seriously. So there's been many steps that have led to that as well. And in terms of the voices from civil society, so South Africa is one of the countries that are plagued by unemployment, inequality, and poverty. And just recently, over 2 weeks ago, there was a protest over fees must fall, whereby students were protesting the right to register in universities, especially considering historical debt, the decolonization of education in the country, and various other demands that students had. And of course, this led to police brutality in the country. So in terms of voices, there's been many marches, many demonstrations and movements that have been built by young women in order to address the scourge of gender-based violence, inequality, as mentioned, and poverty in the country. In terms of the research that we did specifically, these were the 4 things that people focused on. So the first thing was the issue of forced marriages, which sometimes can be misconstrued as cultural practices where young girls, some as young as the age of 14, are sometimes abducted. This is something that doesn't happen across the country, but happens in specific areas in the country, such as the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal. It happens in isolated spaces, but it's quite an issue that a lot of the people that we had gathered for consultations were bringing across. Another issue of gang violence, and especially how it affects women and young children. Another huge issue that was affecting a lot of people, especially in the Gauteng province, was the issue of xenophobia, or what is termed as Afrophobia by some activists, because most of the attacks tend to happen to African in particular Black African migrants. So there are those debates on whether or not to call it xenophobia or call it Afrophobia, but it was a concern in terms of women who are migrants, women who are refugees, and these were some of the issues that they had echoed. And as mentioned before, there's been a number of other activists who've brought to the attention of the president the issue of GBV, which is the highest issue, which is the concern that concerned all South African women or South Africans in general. So in terms of a way forward, in terms of our organization, we felt that it's very important to invest in a new generation of young women peace builders. This is also in terms of how young women and young men are allies to the women, peace and security agenda, and there should be greater emphasis on how to involve them and include them meaningfully in terms of peacekeeping, peace building. And we also recognize the fact that the significance is that we should center women in terms of Resolution UN 1325. And we also do advocate for an intergenerational approach, because we do feel like there's a wealth of knowledge that can be transferred from peace builders who've been in the space for many years onto young women. And these are 4 suggestions of how we can include young women in terms of the women, peace and security agenda in South Africa. As mentioned before, there should be mentorship programs. There should be youth leadership development agencies across the country, and they should be speaking to one another. We definitely want to encourage a situation where a lot of civil society organizations don't work in silos, that there's a lot of communication between organizations. And then also we wanted to redesign programs by working with young women and girls to support their networks and linking up with groups such as the Working Group on the National Strategic Plan on GBV and Femicide. And Fourthly, we felt that young people needed to be included in women mediators networks across several regions in the world. And of course, we want to promote Pan-Africanist feminism, of course. This is linking up with the issue of xenophobia in our country in particular. We feel like this is one of the ways in which we can tackle the issue of xenophobia. And in terms of COVID, we've seen that, of course, GBV has always been an issue in the country, but specifically with the restrictions around COVID meant that a lot of women didn't have access to services that they usually had access to, experienced higher rates of GBV in their homes. And these were some of the issues that we wanted to tackle. And in general, we just wanted to ensure that our women, peace and security agenda going forward always looks at developing issues such as climate change, the current COVID crisis. We just want to be as responsive as possible to these and not as reactionary. And also COVID did affect a lot of women who work in the informal sector, or rather the informal food system sector. And there's always been a shown link between gender inequality and the higher rate of GBV. So we felt like it's a very important sector that the government should invest in and budget for, so that women can be independent and be empowered to leave abusive partners and so forth. And in terms of priorities of action going forward, we're part of the Generation Equality campaign. And so as part of that, we want to promote young women ambassadors. As I had previously mentioned, we want to have a peace award and also a peace center. And before I do run out of time, in terms of the global context, I think we do call for, it was said by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, that it is time to put armed conflict on lockdown and focus together on the true fight of our lives. And I think that's really important, that as South Africa and other nations, that we do call out a lot of nations who continued with conflict even at a crucial time such as COVID, and speak out and do hold governments accountable in terms of this, because there's a lot of this does not happen to reach the news, such as issues in Ethiopia. So it is very important that we do call for governments to cease fire at such a time. And of course, women and girls are the most affected when it comes to issues of conflict. And as much as us in our country, we didn't experience conflict at the time, but there was a militarization of the police during the stricter restrictions of or regulations of COVID. And so this was something also we called out. And because of the networks we do have regionally, the chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights was able to call out our government in terms of the militarization of the police during the time of regulations of COVID restrictions. So I think, just to summarize, the most important aspects for us in our organization is that we do promote young women leaders. We do promote mentorship for young women. And we also, most importantly, do call out and hold other governments accountable for the conflict that continues in their countries, and that we should and strive to ensure that the women, peace and security agenda is invested, because that's another huge thing that our country needs to have a budget towards this particular field. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Haneka, for that. Like just there's a lot. I'm seeing a lot of crossover between what is being said, and also additionally you have that sort of both Pan-African and South African individual perspective as well, just to sort of add to the richness of what we're talking about today. I'm going to bring in our final speaker this part of the session, Coachleen, and then we're going to have some questions and answers. Do keep sticking your if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we will get to them after Coachleen has spoken.
Thanks so much, Louise, and good morning, afternoon and evening, depending on your time zone. And I'm really pleased to be with you from the Department of Foreign Affairs in Ireland today. Although, like so many of you, as you can see, I'm working from home. I really welcome that the purpose of today's session is to look ahead and at ways to reinvigorate the WPS agenda, because the 20th anniversary of 1325 was a really important opportunity to take stock of what has been achieved, but also face up to the disappointing reality that implementation of WPS is just not where it should be. But I think now is the time, with the benefit of that period of reflection and also a year of COVID behind us, to consider next steps. So I'm just going to make a number of points today. Obviously, the WPS agenda is very broad, but as a representative of a national government, I just want to focus on where Ireland's thinking is at on moving the agenda forward, but also preserving it. Firstly, by supporting grassroots activists. Secondly, by ensuring accountability at the international and multilateral levels. And thirdly, partnering with youth. So in terms of supporting grassroots organisations, one of the issues that Ireland was concerned about coming up to the 20th anniversary of 1325 was how WPS was being experienced by grassroots women peace builders on the ground. And as Agnieszka mentioned, Ireland commissioned a report undertaken by her organisation, GNWP, and UN Women to consult with women in 4 different contexts: Colombia, Northern Ireland, Uganda, and South Africa. And one of the issues that was raised, and this has been borne out by other studies, is that lack of funding during the pandemic and the diversion of vital resources is threatening the very survival of many local women's organisations. And this is hugely concerning at a time when we rely on the services of these organisations more than ever. So national governments, multilateral organisations and agencies really need to take a lead. Ireland is trying to do this through its country programmes, but also by scaling up our funding to UN Women and the Peace Building Fund, and supporting the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. But we can't take our eye off this critical issues and let women's organisations disappear. Another issue that the report highlighted was the potential of the pandemic to reinforce a digital divide that excludes women from political and peace building processes due to access to technologies and issues around that. And we are seeing more and more peace building work go online, from mediation to training, and we need to ensure that no one is being left behind. Having said that, I think the transfer of conversations from the physical to the virtual space has really opened up new opportunities for women peace builders to connect with each other. And Funeka mentioned the issue of silos between groups, but also to connect with policymakers. And in the last few months, Ireland, for example, has been able to engage directly with women in areas where we have limited on the ground presence through online platforms that actually we rarely used pre-COVID. So in February, our embassy in Paris hosted an event where our guests of honor were grassroots women peace builders in the Sahel, where we don't have embassies, in countries like Niger and Mali. And this gave us and other government representatives who were attending up-to-date information on what's happening on the ground, and what we can do at the UN Security Council, where Ireland is currently serving a term, to support them. And Ireland hosted another event in New York last October that saw UN ambassadors in New York, people like the chair of the Elders, Mary Robinson, civil society groups like GNWP and others talk directly to women peace builders from literally all over the world in real time. And while in-person interaction will always be important, I think that digital formats do allow for more regular face-to-face or screen-to-screen conversations between practitioners, policymakers, and academia. And I think we really need to harness this change in the period ahead. The other area I want to highlight in terms of advancing WPS is the opportunity that national action plans give us to drive forward implementation. And I'd like to congratulate Funeka and South Africa on its new plan. So as of January, I had noted down that 95 states have national action plans now. I guess it's 96. And it's a really good time to reflect and share on what works well and what could be improved. So it's particularly positive to see civil society engaged in the drafting and implementation of so many action plans in more and more contexts. Ireland's very involved in lesson sharing about our own NAP, but we're also learning constantly about best practice from other contexts. So I'm going to move on now because I've been focused a lot on kind of implementation on the ground, but I also want to look at the issue of accountability kind of at the top, specifically in the area of participation by women in peace processes, which, as we know, is a really key aspect of the WPS agenda. So Ireland supports women's participation in all tracks of political and peace processes, including through capacity building. But it's becoming really starkly evident that capacity just isn't the issue in terms of getting women to the table in peace negotiations, particularly at track 1 and 2. They're simply being excluded. We know from numerous studies that women's participation leads to better outcomes in peace negotiations, more enduring peace agreements, enhanced implementation. But we know from the UN Secretary General's latest report in WPS that women comprise only 6% of mediators, 6% of signatories, 13% of negotiators of peace processes between 92 and 2019. And just last week, we only saw one woman at the Afghanistan talks. So Ireland has used its seat at the Security Council and its first kind of major event of its current term, an area formula meeting, to highlight how, at the very least, the UN itself should ensure that the processes it leads should see the full, equal and meaningful participation of women. And that meeting saw really powerful interventions from Rasha Jarham from Yemen, Brona Hines from Northern Ireland, calling on the UN to do better on on women's participation. So it's clear that, you know, a bottom-up approach to women's participation in peace processes isn't enough alone. We need to also apply top-down pressure also. And we're also doing this in the UN Security Council Working Group on WPS, where we get an opportunity to engage directly with senior UN leadership on what they are doing to implement the WPS aspects of their mandates on the ground. And in tandem, I should say that we're working very hard on the language of those mandates and other UN documents to ensure a continued focus on WPS. But there are really severe challenges. We're seeing at the UN, at the EU and elsewhere, it's not simply a question of advancing WPS language, it's also increasingly a question of defending it. And even well-established language like gender equality and gender-based violence, and Funeka mentioned the link between gender inequality and gender-based violence, that kind of language is being pushed back on. So we need to stay very alert and ready with like-minded countries to push back against the pushback. And on that note, I think it's been really positive over recent days at CSW to hear the new US administration voice such strong support for gender equality in WPS. So another key issue is the need for governments to partner with civil society and WPS. And I've mentioned this in the context of national action plans, but I also wanted to flag that Ireland in the last few days has been confirmed as a board member of the Generation Equality Forum Compact on WPS and Humanitarian Action, where we'll serve with civil society like Agnieszka's organisation. And this multi-stakeholder group is looking at how to drive forward implementation of existing commitments on WPS. So I'll finish up quickly, but just last but not least, and to kind of pick up on Funeka's remarks and the question in the chat, I would also like to suggest that partnering with youth is a really important way we can reinvigorate and sustain the WPS agenda. And I'm really pleased to see one of our UN youth delegates here with us today, and Youth Action Northern Ireland, which my government supports as well. We've witnessed such kind of energy and passion that young people bring to kind of global issues like climate change. And now through the prism of youth, peace and security, we're also seeing what they can do to promote and sustain peace. And I think there are really clear synergies between WPS and YPS that we can learn from both hold that inclusive peace processes are vital, and also that neither women nor young people are homogenous groups but encompass, diverse identities. And they also identify the need to engage with young men and boys to challenge harmful stereotypes. Another issue, I think, is intergenerational dialogue as an avenue for learning on both sides. I think it's been mentioned already that women who've been involved in peace building in their own communities, as well as in kind of high level peace negotiations, can pass on so much experience to younger people who, we all rely on to maintain peace into the future. So on that note, I'll finish, and thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Kathleen. It was interesting that you were talking about, the opportunities from this new world order created by COVID. Because funny, myself and Jana were talking about this just last night, about how, in fact, CSW is one perfect example of the democratization that can happen as a result of things moving online and engaging differently because you have to, because not everyone can afford to travel, I suppose, every year to New York. Not everyone is granted access to the country that it's hosted in, and that narrowing of the ability of those people to actually participate then narrows the scope of the conversations that are had. So obviously access to internet is a separate issue as well, and that narrows it too. But it is interesting to see the new actors and the new people and the new women around the table in terms of the conversations that we're getting to have. So we have to see the silver linings where they are. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on to some of the questions that have been brought up in the course of our of the conversations. We had a question about merging the women peace and security agenda with the youth peace and security agenda, and I know that all the speakers have actually kind of touched on that. And there's also, if you're interested in having a little read in the chat, there is a really great conversation that has been happening in writing in parallel about that. There was also a question about how moving forward can we also integrate an LGBT plus perspective into our women peace and security agenda. I wonder if any of the panelists would like to pick up on that. Agnieszka, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'm nodding my head because they're two excellent questions. So I'll just speak to them both very quickly. I already responded in the chat a little bit on the YPS question. And I just want to say, I don't think it's about merging them necessarily, because they are two very unique agendas, and with constituencies that have some commonality and then have some differences. And I think it's important, and they're complementary, and it's critical to see them that way, but it's also critical to see how they interact and interlink. And indeed, there are some that would call the youth peace and security the sort of sister resolutions to the women peace and security resolutions, or a sister agenda, and they do share so many commonalities in terms of the drive that came for them from the civil society, from women peace builders and youth peace builders, and that continues, with the civil society engagement and role in the implementation of these two agendas, which is very unique, not common to all Security Council resolutions. And even involvement at the sort of Security Council level, with huge advocacy happening around sort of resolutions when new resolutions are being passed, and the 2535 resolution on youth peace and security, sort of the advocacy and inputs of youth peace builders into that too, following sort of in the footsteps of women peace and security resolutions, being very strongly also influenced by women peace builders. And of course, at the sort of crossing of the two are the young women, who are often the group that is sort of doubly marginalized, right? That suffers the exclusion marginalization because they're women, but also because they're young people, and that is often also excluded from programming on youth that is targeted or tailored to young men, and then programming for women, which is tailored to the older the women who are sort of beyond that youth youth bracket. So it is critical to look at these similarities, at these intersections. We hold a lot of intergenerational work, intergenerational dialogues, activities to sort of bring our more seasoned colleagues, seasoned members, and those that are older in age together with young women that we work with to share experiences and learn from each other, because the learning is really a two-way street, and for the agendas to learn from each other too. There are also differences in how the implementation is being approached. The youth, peace and security community, let's say, is not leaning towards adopting national action plans, which we have been supportive of in terms of the implementation of women, peace and security as a tool to really ensure the tailoring of the commitments, the institutionalization of the agenda at the national level, and then the accountability. For youth, peace and security, there hasn't been really a strong drive to have national action plans, but instead there are youth, peace and security strategies or policies. But I think it's also interesting to look at how these documents, whatever they are at the national level, that they're not siloed, that they correspond and convert each other. And then very briefly on the LGBT QI inclusion in the women, peace and security agenda implementation, I think it is critical. So at the sort of policy and rhetoric level, we do try and bring it in the especially the sort of LGBTI women who are just the same part of the women, peace and security agenda as anyone, and bringing that to the attention that there might be in any gender analysis that should also be sort of further disaggregated, and there should be sort of specific lenses and this intersectional analysis. I think that stands at the beginning of it, and also and we engage with LGBTQI individuals in our activities whenever and wherever possible. And whilst it is extremely important to have these protection measures and plans in place, it's also possible in more contexts and more instances than we would imagine. So I think it's important to also not keep that assumption or presumption that it wouldn't be possible or it wouldn't be safe to engage with these communities, but rather ask. There are organizations, women-led, youth-led, LGBTQI-led organizations that would be able to advise on whether and how these groups can be engaged safely. There is, of course, we wouldn't ever force people to sort of identify or attend a meeting as LGBTQI individual, but providing that space for self-identification. It's possible more often than we would imagine. So it's important to think about it and to ask these questions as we do an analysis and plan any work meant or directed at women, peace and security implementation.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka. And I suppose, it's something that has been touched on, that intersectionality and I know, Funeka, you mentioned it as well when it came to the intersectionality between the, women, peace and security and xenophobia or anti-African sentiment, excuse me. And, there is such an importance to be able to overcome our, I think, inherent human need to pigeonhole and categorize and compartmentalize, because on one hand we need to hold that these things are there are individual issues and uniquenesses to different groups and individuals, but at the same time I recognize the interconnectedness both in the work that we do and then when we are lobbying our governments to ask them to be able to do that. And it's a complex ask, but it's something that is absolutely necessary if we are to, we must reflect the realities of human complexity if we're going to, really move forward in that. I wonder if any of the other two speakers would like to come in and sort of add anything, or we do have other questions that people are dying to ask as well. I think, Funeka, were you wanting to come in there?
Yes, I'd just like to say, Agnieszka summarized everything so beautifully. I'll just like to speak just briefly on in terms of LGBTI issues. Yes, these are two really great questions, and there is really a difficulty in terms of a lot of NGOs work.
Have we lost your sound a bit there, or is it just myself? Rebecca, I think we've lost your sound, unfortunately. So I might come back to you if we're able to. Yeah, your sound is gone, unfortunately. I tell you what we'll do is, well, we'd like to come back to what you were saying there, but in the meantime, I have a question for Coachleen. Considering the UK and Ireland's unique experience of the peace processes here, how are you working with the UK? In particular, the question of Brona had noticed briefings about the Afghan peace process, gender framework on the ground in Afghanistan, and the questions around sharing knowledge. Do you have anything you wanted to sort of just bring in there, Coachleen?
Yeah, just to say, I feel like the WPS kind of community, whether you're kind of looking at grassroots organization or governments or at the international level, but there's really great cooperation, and there really is between national governments as well. And we engage a lot with the UK through, there's a WPS focal point network where you get government contacts, sharing updates in the WPS space. So we would engage with the UK there. We also engage with the UK. They have a very different approach to their national action plan, but we engage with them on kind of lesson sharing and best practice. And that's really important. And then obviously, the UK's at the Security Council. They're the pen holder on the WPS file. Ireland's co-chair with Mexico of the WPS working group. So again, we've really great kind of interaction with UK colleagues there, and we're really very like-minded on a lot of WPS issues. So they're a great ally. Ireland hasn't been working specifically on the Afghan peace process. It's not a UN-led process, but yes, we do very much engage with the UK. And just to kind of pick up on some of those points about LGBTI individuals and youth. Yeah, I agree with Fineka that Agnieszka really kind of summarized or stated the position kind of very eloquently. We don't want to conflate WPS and YPS or separate agendas, but there's definitely learning in terms of how we approach those two agendas. And also I think there's a really important issue around inclusivity, and that touches on the LGBTI issue, because we mentioned before that women aren't a homogenous group. They face many and varied forms of discrimination, including for belonging to kind of LGBTI plus communities. So in Ireland's National Action Plan, we recognise the intersectional approach. We recognise LGBTI identity can be a reason for discrimination, and I think really that emphasis on inclusivity is something that the WPS agenda brings to the table. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Coachleen. Fineka, I want to come back to you because I don't want to be disenfranchising your voice. If you're able to speak to us, how are you doing?
I'm doing better. I hope it remains so. I wanted to reiterate in terms of LGBTI persons. We do work with on the National Task Team on LGBTI rights, and I won't lie, it hasn't been perfect trying to merge the Women, Peace and Security agenda with the work that they do, and it's quite important in some instances to keep the two groups separate, but it's also important that to keep in mind every time we do consultations, host events on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, that we do ensure that there is sufficient representation, especially from LGBTI persons, because we want our approach to always be intersectional, and and that means in every aspect, in terms of also the rural-urban divide in our country. And we're one of the countries that has a lot of languages, and so language sometimes is part of the issue. So I just think it's crucial to ensure that in going forward, the future rather of Women, Peace and Security agenda without inclusivity is not going to go really far if we are not very cognizant of the LGBTI community. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Fineka. Speaking of inclusivity, this conversation would not be complete without speaking to, the women who are the young women coming up in our future. And we have 4 of them here today, and I just want to make sure that they have epic space so that they can share their views with us. I'm going to first come to Cyrla Boyle. Cyrla is a teacher, youth worker and mother from Derry in Northern Ireland, and was inspired by the youth outreach services she engaged with as a teenager, and she's since dedicated her professional life to strengthening national and international relationships and providing young people from all over with a creative way to exercise global citizenship. Cyrla, I'm going to hand it over to you. You have roughly 5 minutes because we want to have some time for Q&A, but it'd be brilliant to hear from you. Thank you.
Hello, the stopwatch has started then. So yeah, just thank you so much for having me here today. It's an absolute pleasure to be asked to speak with everyone. So yeah, I just prepared a little thing, but a little bit about growing up in Northern Ireland. So growing up in Northern Ireland has gifted me with some of the greatest moments of incomparable beauty and happiness, but there was always an accompanying ache and an indistinguishable din, creating an undertone of strife in the community. It wasn't unusual for me at 8 or 9 years old to knock on the neighbours' doors from the beginning of August. Have you got anything for the bonfire? My friends and I would say. There's a few old doors in the back and crates too if you want them, they'd reply. So off we went, with our bits of wood and doors and debris on our backs and under our arms, delighted to have contributed to what was simply the tradition. There was an innocence, and I was never raised to hate or discriminate. But it was only as I got older that I understood the political symbolism behind bonfire night and everything else that we had considered to be tradition. And then I began to question the motives and the repercussions of this stark them and us notion. I've had the joy of over the last year of working with two incredible groups of young women from both the Protestant and the Catholic communities, helping them engage in 3 core focuses. So personal development, citizenship and good relations. So despite their hearts being strong and their stories awe-inspiring, it was fairly early on that I noticed the remaining divide, one that was reminiscent of my younger years growing up in a nationalist and Republican area. It was naive of me to think that 15 years on, in a new generation of young people, that this once wide open wound would have been mostly stitched back together by now through inter-community programmes, peace studies and national and international dialogue. It was clear that the concept of peace had to be at the forefront of the programme, enabling the girls to find a platform for discussion, to raise their feelings and apprehensions and slowly and steadily work towards a peaceful future. It was astounding how through basic education and dialogue there was a resounding exhale. What I observed, particularly in our loyalist and Protestant community, there was an unwillingness in the parents and the older generations to discuss the troubles with their children, leading to an underlying sense of shame and guilt, almost like that they were carrying the burden of their history without being able to fully understand it and only feeling like they were to blame. This has led to a perpetuated reluctance to integrate with the other community for fear of being rejected or, in the worst cases, attacked. Shared universally was the reverberating sense of grief, remorse, hostility and lack of direction in our Northern Irish communities. There is an intrinsic compulsion in families directly affected by the conflict over the years to act on the human instinct of tribalism. There is a host of social housing developments that are home to one community or the other, and there is a lack of integrated social housing. There's a notable social development and reduced animosity and crime in areas that are seen to be mixed, but these come at the price of private rentals or being a homeowner. Here in Northern Ireland, we have spent a total of £1.25 billion in the last decade alone, funding segregated education. And here is where we see some of the core divisions. If this fund were to be reallocated elsewhere and used to prioritise community unification, we might be able to see a knock-on effect in our political elections, our social integration, and even people's choices for living locations and employment. Now to consider where we must focus our resources. 7 years ago, I was fortunate enough to be invited to a wonderful international Erasmus Plus programme entitled Sounds of Peace. A group of young people from Northern Ireland joined forces with participants from Armenia, Georgia, Turkey and Poland to spend 9 days building relationships through music and understanding how peace is defined, compromised and built in each of the countries. The final product, a live performance in Yerevan, was reflective of the strengthening of knowledge and the compassion through creative means. It was a symbolic event and helped me recognise that our shared peace crises and that there is a world outside the Northern Irish bubble to learn from, contribute to and celebrate our diversity with. Hillary Clinton once said, the need for peace in Northern Ireland goes well beyond political stability. It now speaks to regional Europe and even global stability. International peace building is imperative, particularly as a young Irish woman, where our history, rights and peace go hand in hand. There is no difference to our international allies, and this is not different in our international allies, and through intercultural dialogue and youth mobility, we can give our young people the tools and opportunities to create global solidarity. Equally, it is paramount that we as a youth service provider and as a society offer the tools from the ground up to our young people so that they can begin to eradicate the fear and apprehension, acknowledge, process and heal from the past, and look beyond the status quo that has come to define our existence in Northern Ireland. I dream of the day that our society isn't dictated by green and orange. I long for a just democracy and fair and comprehensive political representation. I want to promote self-education and learn from the turmoil of the past and allow our children to grow and prosper in a society where their voices are heard. I want my daughter to know her worth, her safety, her rights and her strength, with the concept of divisiveness only but a distant memory. There you go.
Wow. Sarah, I absolutely loved the absolute sheer poetry of your beautiful descriptions there of your experiences. And I suppose, like, creativity and art and sort of spoken word and narrative, it has long been an Irish tradition of and cultural means of tackling difficult issues and starting healing processes. So I did think that what you said about carrying the burden of their history without fully understanding it, and it comes back to communication and education, and our common humanity. But thank you so much for sharing your words and your experiences with us today. Next up we Oh, I just muted, apologies. Next up, we have Yara Alacha. She's the parliamentary researcher for the Civil Engagement Group in Shanadaran, which is the upper house of the Oireachtas, which is Ireland's national parliament. She's also a board member of the Amala Association and of Women for Election. Yara, it's great to have you here with us today.
Hi, thank you so much. That's a really hard act to follow, Cyrilla. Thank you so much for that amazing contribution and for all the contributions so far. They've been incredibly insightful. And I suppose when I was trying to put my thoughts together for my contribution, I was really thinking, what should I focus on? I really wanted to speak to my experience as someone who grew up their whole lives in Ireland, treated differently. Should I focus on my background as a Muslim, as an Arab, Irish second generation immigrant to two parents who are part of the Palestinian diaspora? Or do I focus on the inequalities faced by me, by people in the Muslim community and in minority communities more broadly? And I suppose I decided to intertwine and interrelate all aspects of my identity and speak to the broader issue here at hand, which is compounded intersectional structural inequalities, including gender-based discrimination, but also xenophobia and racism. And the fact that within every stage and phase of my life, inequalities restructured every time, posing in a different light every time. Inequality persists in virtually every domain that matters for human well-being. And it meant for me growing up in a Catholic, predominantly white school in an Irish suburb that I experienced bullying because I looked different. I grew up with crippling anxiety as a child because although I could acknowledge and realizing that teasing and making fun of people was almost part of kid culture, I knew that the hostility aimed at me was extremely targeted. I knew by the way the teachers would subtly pass comments and would in some cases empower those who targeted me. I knew I had a tough journey ahead of me, and that did happen. But I suppose that's on a very individual, local level. And I think when we speak in the global context, when we look at broader global injustices, such as climate injustice, there's a British MP, Labour MP, David Lammy, he said once that racial injustice and climate injustice are rooted in the evil notion that some lives are more important than others. And although the climate crisis will leave no country or community unaffected, its social impacts deepen the inequalities that we see throughout the world in terms of the most marginalized, with not enough being done to address these impacts. The inequalities of society couldn't be more clearly evidenced by the fact that, minority groups, the Black community, minority, Indigenous communities, those who are least responsible for climate change and its impacts are already feeling the consequences before many other communities. It's no coincidence that we see in communities around the world that the cheapest housing tends to be next to the busiest roads, and many of the lowest paid jobs are in the most polluted industries. People of colour and marginalised communities consistently lie at the bottom of the housing, educational and employment ladders. So I suppose to conclude, a peaceful future for me means inclusive institutions, and like Agnieszka mentioned, creating a culture of peacefulness that is fostered through protection, true empowerment and true inclusivity for minority groups. diversifying our infrastructures. I mean, we simply cannot talk about feminism without tackling racial injustice and xenophobia at all levels, from our own individual unconscious biases and unlearning whatever prejudice we hold, to school education, to our employment practices, to our national policies. And importantly, I think we obviously need representation. I know this is something that's constantly called for, because it's so crucial that voices are heard. We have political experts, we have community workers, we have academics, we have skilled professionals. Bring them in and challenge our exclusionary practices that reject and exclude minority groups. Make space for them, give up your space for them and hear them. It's no longer, I think, acceptable for people to speak on behalf of our needs. We need to be at the decision-making tables. And I suppose on that note, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak alongside amazing panelists, and I hope we can, within our own forums and our own spaces in our different communities and corners and societies, that we begin to initiate these conversations and initiate the changes we want to see on a larger scale. I think at this moment in time, we all have some level of responsibility. So I think I'll leave it at that note, to leave space and time for discussion. So thank you for inviting me and for facilitating this really important conversation.
Thank you so much, Yara, for that. I suppose, yeah, the thing I was really struck by there was, you talk about your individual and your local experience, but if you think like Exit CSW shows that when all these women come together, what we feel as our individual experiences are replicated, not necessarily exactly, but similarly across the world. And that speaks to acts of marginalization that are, global, and they're structural, and they're, it's global structural discrimination and injustice. And I suppose when you talk about, these things can't be, disentangled from context. They can't be disentangled from racism. They can't be disentangled from economic, social, and cultural rights and the cultures in which we're brought up. And we have to have those complicated conversations. So thank you for bringing that to the table today. Next up, we're going to hear from she's been mentioned already before by Coachleen, because she is the United Nations Youth Delegate for Ireland, and I hope, I'd love to hear more about that actually as well, what that means and what that is. But Tara Grace Connolly is here. She's going to tell us what what peace building and peace means to her. So Tara, it's wonderful to have you here today.
Hi, thanks for having me. So thank you for the kind introduction. I'm Tara Grace. I'm from Belfast, and as Louise said, I'm one of the UN Youth Delegates for Ireland this year for 2020-2021. The UN Youth Delegate Programme, a real whistle-stop idea of what it is that 2 young people from the island of Ireland are selected to represent 1.3 million Irish young people in Ireland's official delegation to the UN. So we work with DFA, the National Youth Council of Ireland, and the Permanent Mission in New York to try and inform their agenda at the UN and to include the perspectives of young people in Ireland. Something that, it's a role that has existed long before I was ever in it, but something that I do bring to it that is different, and as a young person, is that I am the first young person from the north of Ireland, from the 6 counties, to ever be placed in this role, which is something that I take quite seriously, and something that I understand for myself, but for young Irish identifying people in the north is something of significance. An awful lot of what Fearless said earlier on really resonated with myself when I think about peace building. I also am from a nationalist Republican area. I'm from a working class family. I am first generation university. I'm from a background of women that really suffered because of the conflict, that there was an awful lot of loss in my family, and that it was women in my family that carried a lot of pain, and that has led me to where I am today. And I'm very conscious that I carry on that legacy of women in my family, that because of the time, just by virtue of living in a generation where there was peace, that I have been afforded opportunities that women in my family were all capable of, but could never realise. And so much what Sarah said about the realisation of peace when we no longer think about green and orange kind of really informs the work that I do today and my vision for what I want peace to be here. I mentioned being first generation university. I went to Queen's and did law and politics, and I recently graduated with a master's degree in international relations, and I actually chose the theme of my dissertation to be on comparative implementation of women, peace and security in Northern Ireland compared to the UK and the Republic, and to realise that the space that we exist in the North is a contentious space anyway. We think of it as contentious based on green and orange division. We so rarely at times really look at the gendered implications of that and the gendered impact that has. and how women's issues in amidst the flags and the division and the green and orange, that the very everyday real life lived experiences of women are often forgotten. And I know we have a really amazing, robust women's sector here that do amazing work to advocate for the fact that those experiences really aren't heard in the way they should be. And that when we look at how our political institutions are shaped here, they are not shaped in a way that are designed to benefit the progression of women, of the progression of queer people, that we have a political system here that is designed to uphold binary on one axis politics, with very little space to progress and push forward ideas that are outside of those boundaries. And when we look at the implication of, I know the big topics at the moment are COVID-19 and in particular Brexit in the North. If you look at the implications of Brexit, so much of our human rights-based legislation in the North is directly derived from the EU, and we exist in a vacuum in the North of, we are neither British enough to be women's rights to be fully realised in the British Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan, but we also exist in sort of legislative vacuum when it comes to the Republic. Although we are included in those discussions, there is very little that can be done by no other means, and it is not within their legislative capacity. And it's something that I think, when we think of peace in the North, we always think of that green and orange division, and we need to remember where the peace that we have now came from, and the people that pushed us here. That we wouldn't, the Good Friday Agreement and the peace that we have really wouldn't exist without the likes of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, without the characters of Mo Molan, the women that carry that forward. And when I think of peace in Northern Ireland, I think not only of a day where we move past sectarianism, because that's the line that we always hear, although it is important. We need to realise that peace here doesn't necessarily just mean that, but it means the realisation of the rights of women, the realisation of the rights of LGBTQ people that have been oppressed for so long, and that we're only realised to an extent because of intervention from the British government. And that real peace should mean being able to have the freedom to be able to advocate for your own rights and to be fully realised as equals in the society. I think, not to be totally politicising things, but the recent discussions reproductive rights in the Northern Ireland Assembly in the last week was a stark reminder of how far we have to go, that peace doesn't just mean women's bodies are not being continually weaponised and politicised and used as point scoring mechanisms. So I feel like, well, I kind of didn't have much additional to add from the two amazing speakers that came before me. I know that Yara said she had a tough act to follow. I had two very tough acts to follow. But I hope that kind of gives an idea of that there's a very layered approach to what peace means in Ireland, and particularly in the North. And it's something that we really need to unpick, because we aren't really going to progress much further forward unless we look at the very foundational roots of why those inequalities continue to persist. Thanks.
Hear, hear, Tara. Tara Grace, thank you so much. And I suppose there is something there about the connectedness, that the realization of peace is also the realization of potential, because actually as a society we benefit from women who have, and Yara, you spoke to this as well, and Sarah, you did as well. There's something great when we have inclusiveness, and we're not just trying to pick up the pieces, but we're actually actively building and creating this wonderful shared future. We have the advantage of all these women and people from minority backgrounds, whatever they may be, who are able to fulfill their potential, and the benefits to society far outweigh anything. It's just, so it's a benefit to all of us for this to happen, and I think people very, very rarely look at it that way. I think there's something to be said as well for mentioning COVID and Brexit, and my favorite phrase when I talk about these things is it's the not now love moment. The men are talking, we've got busy things over here to do, and the same thing happened, the same conversations happened during our conflict. Not now love, we can't talk about domestic abuse because the men are busy dealing with the conflict, without realizing women are 51%. We are the priority. We are the society, And we're not a marginal side event. We are the main event, and we should be the priority. And our issues are society's issues. So before I go off on my own rant, we still have to hear from one more young speaker, who's coming from our sister organisation NAWO in England. It's Aroha Phillipson, who's a twice accredited NAWO youth delegate and the Young Women's Alliance chair. She's also a marine biology student in University of Exeter, and is passionate in what she says is a holistic and intersectional approach to advancing gender equality that prioritises women's physical and mental health, women in decision making, and comprehensive and inclusive sexual health and relationships education worldwide. Aroha, it's wonderful to have you here, and we're really looking forward to what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I mean, having followed all of those wonderful women before me, honestly, I'm just so in awe, and thank you for everything you guys are doing. And can I just say how wonderfully human this panel is, and the reiteration of such emotional and really brought me to tears. I really just in such a wonderful space, and like people before me have said, have been creating spaces for people to speak. I think talking about peaceful futures, I think that's really interesting to look at the root causes, as people have said, for the inequalities that persist. And for me, it's recognizing that these problems are much bigger than the individual, even though they have multiple manifestations in the one. They are not about the me, but the us. And as you said, we are the minority, we are the majority, we are the priority of society, and we need to recognize that. I think there needs to be an attitudinal and method approach change, from rather, not now love moment, and from speaking over, but to speaking with and listening to. It's that the listening, the empathy, and the understanding that needs to come to allow for peace, because listening allows for understanding, which allows for peace, which allows for freedom for everyone. And I think that is so key, because you cannot treat things in isolation. You must have holistic, intersectional, interconnected, and diverse approaches and understandings of everything in society and all the inequalities that people experience. Because, like we've said, we have this tendency as human beings to try and put things in boxes, but in all our uniqueness and our beautiful creativity and many forms, you cannot therefore put the complex problems that are associated with human beings into simplified boxes, even though the principles are the same and are simple, and we all experience the same life cycles despite the very many manifestations. And I think for me, the core issues is many and diverse, but healthcare and the many inequalities within the healthcare system, violence against women, women in decision making, and economic injustice. Many of these things I feel are rooted in gender stereotyping and gender roles that are attributed to people in young moments of their life. And I think that draws back to education, and education across institutions, not just schooling, primary school, secondary school, but university, within the workplace and beyond. And I think that is the removal of gender stereotyping to alleviate the pressure from both the sectors. As we have said in this, it's beneficial to all people in society to achieve equality for women, because not only do we empower the women to do anything that they can do in which they have full capacity to do so, but just haven't had the accessibility to achieve that, but also alleviating the pressure of men to strive for a certain way of being, when actually expression and passion and peace is much more key, and will, I think, allow them to be much more effective and valued partners to the advancement of equality. And I think that also comes into understanding and having a more comprehensive and inclusive sex education, because sex, whether you are participating in it or not, is such a large part of life. I mean, not only in social media, but in commercial areas, sex sells. And I feel that sex education is so essential, because it is the root cause of so much to do with violence against women, of health inequalities and also mental health issues. I feel that the educational systems across the world must prioritize not only the biology of conception and sexually transmitted diseases, but the differences between sex, gender, sexuality, the harmful practices such as FGM, the manifestations that are very diverse of both sex and relationships. We need to normalize the diverse families in the world, and also we need to understand the red flags of unhealthy relationships, not only those within romantic partners, but with people that we interact with every day, and simply teaching respect amongst all human beings and respecting their freedom, because where your freedom starts is where someone else's ends. I think also enthusiastic consent is essential, and also prioritizing just pleasure for all genders, all sexes, binary or not, and equal pleasure, as well as hygiene, comfort, happiness, just in all sectors of life, but also sustainable solutions to period poverty, and especially as well redefining what we perceive as essential education. I think that a lot of the time we see this across the world in perhaps less developed areas, that the things that are so key are, you know, basic mathematics and literacy skills, and then also life skills, and you know, that's the ability to stay hygienic, cooking, and I think, you know, physical health and nutrition should be essential throughout all sectors of education. Sustainability should be taught, as women being stereotyped as, you know, the primary caregivers. We have so much power to contribute to the climate change issue, because sustainability is first and foremost in our own hands in the household. And I think that really opens up a lot for civil society space to be like, wow, we can really make a change in such a somewhat, or at least for me, many of the time, an inaccessible issue. I also think mental health, education on mental health issues, and also the access and what we can do to prioritize people's happiness and peace in multiple different sectors, and not just external conflict but internal conflicts as well, I think is a really key thing for me. And so in terms of how we should act, I feel like we should think global and act local. Very much that we see those common themes throughout all of inequalities in the world, and really applying that to your space at home in your community, because I feel sometimes I look at all these big issues in the world and I'm like, how can I tackle those things? And it's like, well, how do those things relate to where I am right now? I think that's very key. And understanding that we do all go through the same life cycles, and it's just that we have different stories and different branches for each of our life trees. I think we need to remember to question things, because just because we're comfortable does not mean that that is an acceptable thing. We need to redefine what we find acceptable in society, and because the way the world is actually how every person sees it. There's not one right answer to anything. There is a perspective which determines the right course of action. And I also think that we must focus on collaborative instead of competitive approaches to equality across all sectors, to reach back and pull forward the people who have been left behind, because nothing about us without us, and nobody gets left behind, is essential for true equality, which will not be achieved otherwise. And to support and to celebrate our differences and our diversity and our uniqueness, because in diversity you overcome adversity. I think that is so key, to redirect the energy of somewhat, you know, wasted time in society for all this negativity, to redirect that to the positive sectors of bolstering and making robust and effective infrastructures across the worldwide, to include women and to include men in the advancement of equality for women, and honestly to make happy people around, because happy people don't do horrible things, I think is exceptionally key. So yeah, let's make people happy through equality.
Thank you so much, Aroha. I love what you're selling, and I want to live on your utopian island because the world sounds amazing if we could make that happen. Especially I just thought what we were talking about earlier about dialogue and communication, and it's not just about talking and waiting for your turn to speak. It's also about that active listening, and it's about listening to the experience of others, learning from them, and kind of then stuffing that in and adding that to your worldview so that it just becomes more expansive and we understand each other better. And I suppose it is finessing that and having that mutual understanding is how we build our vision of what society should look like. And that's when we go from peace being the absence of violence to what is active peace. So I just want to thank all the four young women for sharing their perspectives today. I'm so excited. You should all be president. But what I will do is, we have 5 minutes left. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask you a quick fire question. And it's, are you optimistic for the future, for your community, for your society, and for humanity and striving for peace? So if I could ask you for just a quick sentence or two before we finish off, because we don't want to hear me talking, we want to hear more of you. So I'll start this time with Tara Grace.
Me?
Yes.
Sorry, my audio cut out that exact second. Honestly,
I'm so sorry.
You're right. Honestly, absolutely yes. I think you don't really have to look beyond the island of Ireland to see amazing change makers on the ground, young people working in organisations. Think of movements like Fridays for Future, really amazing young people in Ireland itself. And then as youth delegate, I've been really lucky and really privileged to engage with fantastic activists from across the world. And there is so much potential there and so much willingness to work together across borders. Yeah, I'm really hopeful.
Oh, thank you, Tara Grace. The next person on my screen is Aroha. Are you feeling optimistic? I think you are.
Can you guess? Yes, I am confident that women will achieve equality, gender equality, and I'm even more confident that with the inclusion of all peoples, especially men, to advance the gender equality, we will achieve it much, much faster. And with the inclusion of women, not only will we achieve equality, but a heightened universal and global citizenship and society that is really productive in its positivity. So I'm very, very optimistic.
Thank you so much, Aroha. Yara, how are you feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what was said before, and I mean, what is living without hope? I'm totally inspired by just hearing about the initiatives that I've heard today, and just the general, I suppose, mobilization of the youth, of civil society support. And I'm a firm believer in introspection and analyzing your own behavior and thinking and challenging yourself first and foremost. And I think we're seeing more of that, and yeah, I'm totally optimistic. Yeah.
Thank you, Yara. And finally, Cirla.
Yeah, I mean, I was optimistic. My optimism has just shot through the roof since being a part of this today. Just absolutely thrilled, exhilarated to hear so much, comprehensive input from so many incredible women. And it's, engaging with people like yourselves, people like you that are, so actively involved all over the world in making this world a better place and making sure that global citizenship and peace are at the forefront. And yeah, absolutely, just ready for the next step, ready for those steps to be productive, and so full of hope, so full of hope.
I think that's a wonderful place to end our session today. And I just want to thank absolutely everybody for taking part today. I don't know about you, but I'm completely invigorated. I'm ready to go and, kick ass and make the feminist future just happen tomorrow outside my doorstep. But one thing I would say is, let's not finish it here. We've met some wonderful women today in our session. Let's keep that communication open, both the dialogue and the active listening, and see what we can do together to support each other's individual campaigns, but also the one thing that we've learned today is that it's all interconnected. It absolutely is. So it just leaves me to, with 1 minute to go, not bad, is to thank everyone for today and just enjoy the rest of your CSW. And it was wonderful to meet you all. So bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
nice day,
you, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody. Bye.